Hey, David.
I can see you. You can't see me. Now you should be able to see me.
Yes, it's loading. Oh, great. There you are. Okay, let me make sure the recording is running. And it appears to be. Um, Thank you so much for agreeing to come on my podcast. I haven't named it yet. This is a new podcast. This is going to be, I think, well, I don't know if it'll be episode 2, but it's the second interview I've done. So I'm trying to get a chunk of interviews done so I can release it and have a nice pool of content and maybe be ahead of my schedule so that if I miss a week, I'll be able to do that. So bear with me if this is maybe a less professional interview than you're used to being a part of, because I have very little experience conducting interviews and talking to a camera for that matter. So a little bit about me. I'm starting what I might call a libertarian organization, and it's not what you would consider to be a traditional think tank or anything like that, where you're coming up with academic policies and stuff like that. What it is it's actually going to be. I haven't necessarily fleshed out all the details, but what I want to do is I want to provide support to entrepreneurs and business people who want to incorporate libertarian, specifically anarcho-capitalist ideas into their businesses. And so one area that I'm trying to research right now is private security around the world. And I want to see if there's any way of bringing private security to the consumer more so in a model, maybe something more in line with what your book says and what other anarcho-capitalist theorists say, and just try and bring maybe some sort of insurance model of private security to a market, and maybe in the United States, maybe not. So I'm looking into that. That's kind of my general research. This is like a long-term project of mine. So in complement with this effort, I'm also starting a podcast. So that's kind of what you're being interviewed in association with right now. So I guess now I should introduce you. This is David Friedman. He is the author of many books. He has also made a lot of contributions in economics, and he is a professor at a law school, Santa Clara Law School, at Santa Clara University. I'm sorry. And interestingly enough, he does not have a PhD in economics or a JD. I believe you have a PhD in physics. Is that correct?
Correct.
So that is very remarkable. And he has written, particularly, most notably, one of my favorite books, Machinery of Freedom. It's been very influential to me. I've found it changed my mind on a lot of issues coming at anarcho-capitalism from a Rothbardian perspective. So I guess kind of one of the questions I've had is why did you study physics?
Because I didn't want to spend my life being identified as my father's son.
Okay. Right. So just in case no one caught on, David Friedman is the son of Milton Friedman, a very famous economist. And so that makes sense. Do you still do any work in physics?
No, I haven't for a very long time.
Mm.
And I don't work in the same area my father did, which was basically macroeconomics.
Right.
I do, as it happens, work in an area that my uncle worked in, but he wasn't nearly as famous, so that wasn't a problem.
Right. That makes sense. But your father, that since we're on the subject, is, I guess, what people might call like a minarchist, or maybe a classical liberal, or just maybe a statist libertarian, depending on how you want to put it. How did you become an anarchist?
Well, I guess the answer is that I was never very happy with the idea that the government could do things that people couldn't do. But I didn't see how you could manage a society without that.
Mm-hmm.
That my view, I suppose, in my late teens, mid to late teens, was that I couldn't see any reason why Congress passing a law gave you any moral obligation to obey it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see how a society could function unless people believed that. Mm-hmm. And eventually I noticed that, oddly enough, I seemed to be the only person in the world who acted as if laws were morally binding. that most people felt perfectly free to drive faster than the speed limit or to offer a glass of wine to a 20-year-old or 17-year-old, whatever the law was at the time, friend. And then it seemed to me that the arguments for the market worked within a framework of property rights and law, but I didn't see how they could provide such a framework. And what changed my mind was a science fiction book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein, which described a fictional society in which law and law enforcement were endogenous, were something that came out of the society rather than a government imposed. And it was not very much like the world I live in, but if it's really impossible, then it's impossible always. So the fact that he gave me one hypothetical counterexample was enough to get me interested in the question of whether you could manage that in something more like our society. And that ultimately produced the arguments in Machinery of Freedom, where I was trying to sketch out what a society with private property, but without government, might look like. Now, since then, I've learned much more about other historical societies. And it turns out that in a certain sense, I was reinventing the wheel. That is, that there have been quite a lot of societies in which law enforcement was private and decentralized. No modern societies, but that what I currently refer to as feud law, meaning a legal system where what makes it work is that if you wrong me, I threaten to harm you unless you compensate me, has existed in a lot of different times and places. And in fact, I think it may be the original legal system that most other legal systems were built on top of. I have pretty good evidence for example, Jewish law, Muslim law, Anglo-American common law, that all of those show evidence of having come out of a system of the sort I'm describing. Now, there are a variety of conditions you have to meet for that to work. You don't want a system where I can pretend you wronged me and then extort money from you with threats. And I have a discussion. The book I'm currently writing, almost finished with, is a book on legal systems very different from ours. And it has a chapter on feud law in which I discuss what are the conditions that a system has to meet in order that feud law will work as a reasonably good legal system. But there have been societies that did a pretty good job at meeting those conditions. So I think it's possible. And that what I was inventing in machinery was sort of a high-tech version, as it were. Just as if you're writing an economics book, you might start with Robinson Crusoe alone on his island, and you eventually get to more complicated things. When I wrote an economics book, I started not quite that far down, but with a world where there were no firms. It was just individuals trading with individuals. That's easier to understand. And there's a sense in which the difference between historical feud systems and what I was sketching in machinery is the difference between a world where the whole economy is individuals trading with individuals and an actual modern world with firms and contracts and employees and a bunch of other things of that sort. So I was describing how a decentralized, privately enforced system would work in an advanced modern society with lots of intermediaries.
Right. So after later learning, first you came up with your own theory on this, and then later learned about historical examples. So has learning about these historical examples changed your mind in any way to like that thought, well, maybe this actually isn't maybe a realistic theory based
I don't think so. The third edition of Machinery, I have some new material discussing ways in which my system might break down or might not work. But that's not really coming mainly out of the historical work. That's mostly coming out of economics. It's that there are fairly well understood ways in which the free market sometimes doesn't do what you would like it to do. And I was seeing how those same ways would apply if you had a market for law and law enforcement, as well as a market for food and cars and things.
It's like, yeah, one thing that I find interesting is that there is really it's two distinct claims that libertarians often kind of maybe get confused a little bit. And one of them is saying, okay, if we didn't have a government, this is a system that could work. I can come up with an idea of like what could happen. And then the other claim is, okay, let's get rid of the government, and then what will we have? And do you think that is what you're proposing? Do you believe that it's kind of more like a natural evolution? Like, say that I'm not saying you're trying to necessarily eliminate the government in one day, but if the government was eliminated in one day, how likely do you think it is that, based on the norms that we currently have, that you're going to?
I don't know.
Yeah, you don't
I
know.
don't know. I think it's very unlikely that the government will be eliminated
No,
in one day.
yeah, yeah, of course not.
And therefore,
Mhm.
the kind of change that I argue for is a continuous change in which you gradually replace things the government is doing with things that are done privately, and gradually reduce the power of government in various ways. I don't want to claim that any society without government is better than any society with government. That's very unlikely. Right. Only that there are plausible pictures of a society without government that would be better than any likely society with government.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, that's good. That's a good answer. So one of my favorite things in your book is talking about your externalities argument. Your argument that externalities can be used as an argument against your system, which it often is, but similarly, you can use that argument against the government. Can you explain that?
Sure. It's broader than externalities.
Okay.
There's a general idea of what economists refer to as market failure. And market failure, I think, is correctly understood as situations where individual rationality does not produce group rationality. That each individual is acting for himself. You would like to have a situation where if I do the right thing for me and you do the right thing for you, that produces the right thing for us. But there are some fairly well understood situations where it doesn't. And the sort of classical example that many people may be familiar with is the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, the story is that two prisoners jointly commit a crime, they're arrested, the DA has enough on them to get them on a minor charge, but he needs a confession from one of them to get them on a major charge. So he makes an offer to each of them of the form, if you confess and he doesn't, I'll let you off with a slap on the wrist. If he confesses and you don't, I'll throw the book at you. If both of you confess, I'll give you a pretty serious penalty, but not quite as bad as if he confessed and you didn't. And if you can set up the numbers in such a way that whatever the other guy is going to do, it's in my interest to confess, even though both of us would be better off if we both stayed silent. And that's the two-person version of market failure. And my point is that market failure exists not just in markets, but in many, many other contexts. It exists because somebody is taking an action where he is not bearing the costs and benefits. So that when I confess, most of the cost is going to my partner, who's now getting a worse deal, and I'm getting the benefit of a lighter sentence, essentially. That situations of that sort sometimes occur in the free market, but they are the exception, not the rule. That on the market, if I want to use labor to build something, I've got to pay the worker enough so that he's willing to do it. If I want to use steel, I've got to pay the people who produce steel enough. If I want to get money for what I'm doing, I've got to get somebody else willing to pay me for my services or to buy what I'm producing. If you work through the logic of that, as economists have been doing for a century or more, it turns out that the first approximation, when I take an action, I bear the costs and receive the benefits. And therefore, if it's in my interest to do it, it's in our interest to do it. All right? It's not always true, but that's sort of the first approximation. There is no such first approximation in the political system. In the political system, almost everybody who acts, whether the voter, the politician, the bureaucrat, is taking action, most of whose costs and benefits go to other people. So if you as a voter spend a lot of time and effort figuring out which candidate is better and then vote for him, that results in a tiny increase in the chance he gets elected. And if he does get elected, that's a benefit shared with 300 million other Americans. You're getting a tiny fraction of the benefit. You have a very, very weak incentive, therefore, to be well informed. And in fact, we observe that voters are very poorly informed as a general rule. There's lots of evidence for that. Similarly, when a congressman passes a law, most of the costs and benefits of that law go to other people. When a judge decides a case and sets a precedent, most of the costs and benefits go to other people. So whereas in the market, the normal situation is that people are making actions where they bear the net costs of the action and therefore do it only if there's a net benefit. And occasionally it's not true. So you occasionally get market failure. On the political market, the normal situation is that people are taking actions where they are not the ones receiving the net benefit, not even a sizable fraction of it. And therefore, it is very often in their interest to take actions that make all of the rest of us, all of us, including them on net, better off. All right, so that's the basic argument, that it's not enough to show that the market is imperfect. The question is it more or less imperfect than the political alternative? And the argument I'm offering suggests that you would expect the political alternative to be much more imperfect.
Great. Yeah, and I've used that line of argument very successfully. But the one thing I tend to get when I do say that is usually some sort of reference to climate change. And it's usually in something along the lines of, well, you're right. Maybe we're going to get some laws we don't like. But I can't foresee any way that what you're proposing is going to produce something to stop climate change. And maybe the incentives are bad, but it's at least possible that if we have like a world government or something, we could enact climate control policy that will solve us from this crisis that's going to destroy us all.
Are the people you argue with in favor of world government?
It's a mix. Sometimes they aren't necessarily opposed to it.
Because as long as you have many countries, the same problem that prevents individuals from dealing with climate change also prevents countries from dealing with climate change. So you've got essentially, for a global externality, you have a market failure problem at the national level. Now, this particular one doesn't worry me because I think there's no reason to expect climate change to be catastrophic. I think that's a wildly overblown claim. One of the things when I get into arguments on this I like to point people at is the latest IPCC report has a figure 10.1, which shows various estimates of the net cost of warming. How much worse off the people in the world would be if temperature went up by some amount. And they measure it as the change in world income that would have the same effect on human welfare. So they're saying 3 degrees of warming makes us as much worse off as having our total income go down by some percentage. It turns out that for warming up to 3 degrees, all of the estimates are in the range of 0 to 3%.
Wow.
So it's a tiny effect. If you imagine, we're talking about a change over about a century. It doesn't take very much to change world income by 3% over a century of compounding. In my view, part of what's wrong with a whole lot of the climate discussion is that people focus on the strong part of the argument, which is the argument showing that temperature is trending up and that the likely cause is human action, and ignore the weak part, which is the claim that it will make us much worse off. That warming is going to have both good and bad effects. If you want to think warming is terrible, you think up all the bad effects and imagine them as bad as you can, and you minimize or ignore all the good effects. If you wanted to do the other, you would do the opposite. So I really think that particular problem at this point is a bogus problem, that the logic of what you're saying is correct. That is to say, a free market anarchist society would not give you the right solution to global warming if global warming was a serious problem. And that's one example of a point that I discuss in the book, that one of the places you get market failure in the market for law is any case where the legal rule between you and me has effect mainly on other people. Because you and the firms that are providing rights protection to you and me are trying to produce the ideal product for their customers, but there's no reason why they should take into account third-party effects by people who aren't their customers. So that's one of the ways in which it's imperfect, and all I can say is yes, but since we've got no mechanism that gets government law to be even that good. Government law not only ignores, for the law between you and me, the effects on third party, it largely ignores the effect on you and me.
Yeah.
And so, so I guess my view in this, as other things, is that all I'm saying is that anarcho-capitalism is better, not that it's perfect, because it isn't perfect. That's
right. Yeah, and I mean, I definitely think there's no way to have a perfect system. Do you think that there's any merit to some sort of argument along this line where you could say that although what you're so like basically what you just said, and then maybe follow that with although that would be bad if, say, global warming was as bad as you can imagine it was.
Suppose global warming really were a catastrophe, then we're in trouble.
Right, but you think that maybe, do you think that there's an argument to be said that once, if you suppose that is true, even still, if it was bad enough, society could still restructure in light of that change, given that it's not instantaneous, and deal with the problem? Like, as you are developing, like, let me see how it says. So say it's going over the course of 100 years and you see it's picking up and it's getting worse. Given that it could, society could reorganize with a state structure. And
maybe. On the other hand, there's sort of an implicit assumption here that humans will organize their societies to solve bad problems.
Right.
I think people have recognized for probably a couple of thousand years that war is a bad thing.
Right.
All right. War kills lots of people, destroys lots of stuff. We have not yet reorganized in a way that eliminates war.
Right. That's true.
That it's not as if there's sort of it's not as if there's a God standing over us who says, all right, here's a problem. You do this, you do this, you do this. We've now restructured you to fix it.
Right.
So it's possible that if warming really started to be catastrophic, maybe that would create enough force so that you would recreate a government in an anarchist system and solve it. Maybe in our system it would create enough force you'd create a world government and solve it. But at the moment, I think those cures are worse than the disease. But I think the correct statement is that an anarcho-capitalist society will not do an optimal job of dealing with the kind of problem of which global warming is a big example. But I guess my view is I don't think there is a way of dealing with that kind of problem. I have a different book, Future Imperfect, which looks at technological revolutions that might happen over the next few decades. And one of the questions it discusses is technological progress always a good thing? And part of my answer is it doesn't have to be a good thing, because in order to have a workable system, we've got to somehow be able to divide up the world so that I control my little bit, you control your little bit, he controls his little bit, and we have some way of interacting, whether it's political or through prices and trade, to coordinate among those. And if the effect of technological change is that the range of the effects of our actions becomes very large, so that anything I want to do is likely to have 90% of its effect 1,000 miles away in anything you want to do. It's hard to see any structure of institutions which could adequately coordinate that.
Right.
All right. A different way of putting it is you've got the problem of how do you coordinate 100 million people or 8 billion people, given that we all depend on each other in some sense, that somebody's got to make the inputs for what I'm doing.
Yeah.
There are really only two answers, and one of them doesn't work. And the one that doesn't work is the obvious answer, and that's central control. That somebody says, you do this, you do this, you do that. He needs this amount of steel, so you mine that amount of ore, you mine the coal we need to it. That'll be enough steel for him to make cars. That's more or less the Soviet model. And it scales very badly. It works for very small organizations, but gets out of hand for large ones. The model that works is some version of decentralized coordination, of which the one we best understand is free market, private property trade. There may be other models that have different institutions, but that have the same structure. It's very hard. If I'm right that the centralized mechanism scales very badly, you don't want to try to use that on a world scale. And the decentralized mechanism requires some way of dividing things up so that I'm making decisions for me and you're making decisions for you. And you can imagine circumstances in which that becomes unworkably difficult. And a world where global warming on the scale we now expect it really has catastrophic results seems to be that situation. I think that's a situation where it's hard to imagine any decent outcome.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's a good answer. You mentioned your book Future Imperfect, so maybe we should talk about that for a little bit. Do you want to maybe just give a quick overview of what is discussed in it?
Sure. I suppose the most general lesson of that, two general lessons, I guess. One of them is that the future is much more uncertain than most people assume. That people tend to more or less assume that 100 years from now we'll be doing things about the same way with a few improvements. You can see that through the whole global warming argument, that people talk seriously about the effect of what we're doing now on life 100 or 200 years from now. And the truth is we just don't know what life will be like 100 or 200 years from now. Things are changing much too fast. So in the book, I am not trying to predict. What I'm trying to do is to sketch a whole lot of possible futures. Here is a revolution that could happen. Here are the issues that would be raised by that revolution if it did happen. For many different ones, so that I look at things like online interaction, encryption, privacy, surveillance, also things like nanotechnology. If we can build things at the atomic scale, we can do extraordinarily effective and sometimes destructive things that we couldn't do before. What if we solve the problem of aging? That everyone alive is currently dying of an incurable disease. It's called old age. Some of us are farther along than others. There's no reason I can see why that disease has to be incurable. That the information for rebuilding your body is in every cell of your body. You've got the same DNA in each cell. That's massively redundant data. So in principle, there should be some way of rebuilding your body as it gets, we just don't know how to do it yet. What would the world be like if we solved that problem? And that's one of the intriguing questions. I have a discussion of mind drugs. The mind drugs we're most familiar with, I suppose, are recreational drugs like heroin or marijuana, or alcohol is probably the most famous mind drug. And you can think of mind drugs being used for pleasure. They get used for performance. Some people find that having, one drink relaxes them and makes them more able to do things. There are things like modafinil that let you function without sleep for a long time. You could imagine that as technology improves, we get better and better at making drugs that improve intellectual performance. And there are drugs that are used to control other people. If you think about the idea of getting a woman drunk in order to seduce her, you could also imagine a drug a credulity drug, a drug that you feed somebody without their knowing, and then they believe what you tell them. So you sell them a George Washington Bridge or something. So I have a chapter discussing what are the issues that are going to be raised if we get much better at making drugs that affect the mind in a variety of different ways. And there's reproductive technology, which people have talked about for a while. And genetic engineering and things like that. So I'm basically looking at a whole lot of different technologies that might develop, and artificial intelligence is another big one. I gave a talk at Google on the book, and if people are curious, on my webpage there's a video of that talk. And I started out by saying that I thought global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe, that I had three different ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. And those are technologies that could go wrong. So that if artificial intelligence produces programmed computers that are much smarter than we are, there is no particular reason to assume they will continue acting in our interest. So at that point, we're gerbils, and we better hope that the new masters of the earth like pets. And that's the pessimistic version of that story.
Right.
Similarly, both biotech and nanotech have the possibility of some bright high school kid in his basement creating the plague that wipes out mankind. And so I discuss with regard to those things, what are the ways they might happen, what are the ways should be kept from happening, and so forth. So those are all things that I discuss in the book. But what's going to happen, I don't know.
Right.
The only thing I'm pretty sure of is that the world 30 or 40 years from now is going to be more different from the world today than most people expect.
Great. So I said this was going to be a 30-minute interview, and we just hit the 30-minute mark. I do have a few more questions if you have time. If not,
sure, that's all right.
Okay. I have not read Future Imperfect yet. It's on my reading list. I'm a computer scientist. I'm a programmer. So I do kind of want to get into some of this future stuff. A little bit of discussion about it. I want to know, so in machinery, you did talk about some of the implications, a little bit about cryptography, and I've heard some of your talks where you talk a little bit about that. What is your thoughts on Bitcoin?
Bitcoin was a surprise to me. I had been talking about anonymous eCash for a long time. Bitcoin is an eCash, but it is arguably the least anonymous money that has ever existed because every transaction is public information to everybody in the Bitcoin network. Although, of course, it's information in terms of accounts, not people. But it shouldn't be that hard to link people to their accounts unless they go to a lot of trouble to keep you from doing that.
Right.
So Bitcoin is a neat idea. I like it. I even have some Bitcoins, although at the moment they're on my old cell phone, and I've got to figure out how to transfer that to my new cell phone. The reason I have some Bitcoins was that I gave a talk for the New Hampshire people, the libertarian movement, their Free State Project.
Yeah.
And they offered to pay my expenses in Bitcoins, and I said, sure. So they did.
Nice.
And I think I made money on it last time I checked.
You probably did.
That was a few years ago. But what I would really like to see is a fully anonymous digital cash. And I understand there are projects for trying to create that along Bitcoin lines, and I have not been following those, so I don't know how far they've gotten. Because you need some way in which people can't trace who made payments to whom.
Right.
And in principle, we know how to do it. We've known for a long time. David Chaum worked out the mathematics, I suppose, 30 years ago, or maybe more than that. And we can set up a system where I can make a payment to you by sending you a message, and I don't have to know who you are. You don't have to know who I am, and the bank doesn't have to know who either of us is. But those systems all require a bank. They all require some institution somewhere that's holding the money and is just shifting who the money belongs to. And it is hard to operate a bank if the government doesn't want you to. I am not sure there's any government in the world that is in favor of anonymous digital currency. Because if you have anonymous digital currency, all money laundering laws become unenforceable.
Right.
Now, that's partly a good thing and partly a bad thing. With anonymous digital currency, kidnapping becomes more practical because you can't be caught while collecting the ransom. On the other hand, government enforcement of drug laws becomes less practical, and government enforcement of lots of other things becomes less practical. So it really is a trade-off.
Yeah. And cartels are the people who mostly kidnap, so if they're going to go to business, probably going to be less kidnappings overall. But yeah, go on.
All I'm saying is that there are, like many changes, there are good and bad effects.
Right.
Somebody, I think maybe one of the cypherpunks, made the line a long time ago, encryption is not your friend. And he's right. It's not your friend and it's not your enemy. It's a technology that can be used for many things, good and bad.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting technology because we know, I think at present, how to set things up to have levels of privacy humans have never had. We could have a world where I could make public speeches without anybody knowing who I am or where I am, where I could do business without anybody knowing who I am or where I am, be paid, and so forth. For that to happen, you need a widely distributed public key infrastructure. And so far that hasn't happened, although I think the NSA, while trying to prevent it, has in some ways pushed us towards it because the various revelations mean that end-to-end encryption is something that a lot of the high-tech companies think is a great idea. So that may happen. That'll be a very, very interesting world. And I argued that you might end up with capitalism online and states in real space.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. I have a very like a very contrarian opinion of Bitcoin, and I guess cryptography in general, decentralized systems for that matter. I don't necessarily share your optimism that it will lead to a more anarcho-capitalist society, although I do agree that it's good and bad. So I think it will probably lead to an equal society in terms of state and not state as we have. So I think it'll be a wash. And this is my take on it. People like to value, it's like take Bitcoin as an example, but this could be applied to any distributed cryptographic system. You can say, okay, once the system is out, it's great. It works. There's mathematically provable that you cannot detect what people are doing or see the messages or whatever the goal of the system is. You can prove that mathematically, and we can be sure of it. And that's good. However, that is overlooking one critical component of software, which is the software development process. And so what I like to say is that Bitcoin is the worst cryptocurrency ever invented. And I mean, that's not exactly true because there's some really bad ones out there. But what my point is that it's the first cryptocurrency for the most part. And all the other ones after it are more high tech, way better, have so many better features. Like there's Zcash, which is a new one, which is, like you were saying, fully anonymous, mathematically proven to be so. I mean, it's 10 times better than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to basically get outdated just as quick as your phone or your computer or any other bit of technology. And inherent in the process of keeping Bitcoin relevant, technologically speaking, or even fixing problems with it, because it's not perfect. You don't develop software perfectly the first time. In that process of updating it, there is a centralized development process. And I know in theory you could say, well, everyone's going to read the source code and vet it, and then it's whatever the most mass adoption is, like all the Bitcoin clients adopt the correct source code, and then if you do bad source code, it won't get it. Like there's like arguments like that, if that makes sense. But that's just not really how it works. And I think there's a lot of tension there, and there's a large tendency to have centralization because it makes things a lot easier and a lot better. And just even in the hardware sphere, if you're getting a computer that has secure cryptography on it, you don't know if the hardware is secure, and there's no backdoor on that. That in and of itself could compromise anything that you do. So, so basically,
I'm not sure how anything you're saying implies that it makes things worse. All
Yes.
you're saying is it might fail.
Yes.
It might be that we have less secrecy than we think we do, and that's certainly possible.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're using open source systems, there are lots of people who are in a position to monitor them, and therefore, if the software has a backdoor in it, there are ways in which other people can discover it.
Right.
Hardware, it's harder to do that, but there are going to be multiple hardware platforms out there, and people can use those ones that they're relatively confident of. It seems to me that if people care a lot about privacy, which I think most people don't, that then I don't see any serious barriers to developing a infrastructure which is pretty secure. There are always going to be risks. There's always the possibility that someone will trick you into giving away your private key. But having a world where most of the people most of the time can talk without anybody else understanding and hearing them is a considerable improvement over what we now have.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I guess I'm just less optimistic on it, and I don't think it's going to bring us I don't think we're going to be worse off because of it. I don't see any way that that's possible. But I could, but I'm just saying that I'm not so optimistic that it's going to necessarily bring about a positive change. I mean, well, I don't know. I guess maybe you do have a point that it might move it into a good direction. But yeah, so I guess so. My last question for you is, what okay, yeah, here I have a list of questions. My last question for you before I let you go is, what do you are you I've heard you say that you don't hope to bring about a libertarian society because you don't necessarily, you're just merely theorizing about it, and you enjoy the subject, so you like thinking about it, and that's kind of what you do in your goal. But do you have any opinion on libertarian strategy? Because one passage from Machinery that I liked was one, and I don't have it up right now, but you're talking about the LP, and you're laying out what you think might happen if the LP gets more influence, how people are going to start to see that power as an opportunity, and they're going to join the LP and then use it opportunistically to control government. And I believe that you're completely right on that. That was honestly mind blowing, because I read Machinery this year as the Libertarian campaign had Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. And I actually posted online in a private Facebook group. I said, I posted the passage, and I was basically pointing out, and everyone agreed with me, that you basically called Bill Weld, who is a Republican, who endorsed Hillary Clinton essentially, and was essentially a neocon. He's essentially a neocon, but and it's very clear that he opportunistically took the vice presidency as a chance of wielding power, and because this election there was a nice, decent, not a very high probability, but a little bit of a shot for the libertarian candidate. So I just wanted to say that I really liked that passage, but also, what is your thoughts, if any, on libertarian strategy, or are you completely
No, I have a variety of ideas about
Mm.
it. One of them is what I'm engaged in, which is to create and spread ideas. That the way I like to put it, microscopes used to have a fine control and a coarse control. For all I know, they still do, but I haven't used a microscope for a long time. And for our political system, the coarse control is the fine control is basically lobbying. The fine control is influence group. The coarse control is majority voting driven by free information. If everybody believes that doing something is bad, then it becomes politically expensive to do it. And free information tends to be of very low quality. And one of the things one can do is to try to change the mix of free information out there. So if you think of something like Ayn Rand's writing, for example, quite a lot of people read it. They read it for fun because it was exciting and interesting books, but it changed what their basic assumptions were. That's true of lots of other examples. I've got an explanation of what economists call the principle of comparative advantage, which is the basic economics of trade. And it's an explanation which has the virtue of being very, very simple and mostly correct. And I've seen lots of people quote it, and by putting that out, I change the number of people whose base assumption about a tariff is it protects us to the people who say, no, a tariff just results in making us poorer. So one of the things you can do is to engage in a long-term project to change the mix of information out there, whether by writing novels or by writing economics journal articles that are read by the people who then teach students, various other ways. That's one project. A different project is creating competitors to government services. So the fact that we have UPS and FedEx means that doing without a government post office becomes much more believable than it would have been 30 years ago. And you can think of a lot of other things, the project you were discussing for private security.
Yes.
You have a world where most people know that what's really protecting them is a company they pay some money to each month, which has somebody who will show up if they're getting robbed. And, well, the police are out there, but who cares about them? In that world, it gets easier to cut the size and expenditure of the police. So creating alternatives to government. Politics is another way, but my view is that what you're trying to do with the politics is not to take power, but to change the policies that the people who do have power find in their interest to follow. So that this is an argument my father made a long time ago, that the great success story of the 20th century is the Socialist Party. Because the Socialist Party in America never won any important elections. I think they had the mayor of Milwaukee for a while. But if you look at what was in their platform 100 years ago, almost all of it is supported by both parties now. Similarly, in my view, if the Libertarian Party got 5 or 10% of the votes, which it's never done, but wouldn't have been absurd to think it might have done it this time. 5% was what they were aiming for. One result of that is that the Democrats and Republicans will say, which are the arguments of these people that we could steal and get some of that 5% to vote for us? And I've been trying for a long time to urge the Democratic Party to try to pull libertarians out of the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party, although it certainly has some libertarian inclinations, has a lot of non-libertarian inclinations. The Democratic Party has some inclinations that libertarians like. And I think that libertarians, broadly defined, not sort of hardcore ideological, but people who in general are in favor of freedom in both economics and social matters, are probably maybe 10 or 20% of the electorate. It's quite a lot of people, even though it's a minority. If the Democrats could persuade those people that libertarian is a kind of Democrat instead of a kind of Republican, that would give them a big advantage in the next decade or 2 decades of elections. And how would they do that? By adopting some libertarian views. Conceivably, in the ideal world, from my standpoint, the Republicans and the Democrats are competing for the libertarian vote. And so each of them has an incentive to try to figure out which are the libertarian policies that fit reasonably well with the rest of our base. And you could then get more libertarian policies enacted. But I think making it in the interest of major parties to adopt the policies is probably a better strategy than expecting to ever win the White House yourself.
Great. Well, that's awesome. And yeah, as you said, like strategy number 2 is the one I'm working on right now. And those are 3 really good strategies. So I really appreciate you coming on. I mean, I know this maybe I'm kind of like stumbling over my words and just getting used to doing interviews and starting a podcast.
And it's perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably not perfect. But.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you. I enjoyed
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.